Happy Constitution Day, everybody, 2020. My name is Robert Johnson, and I'm going to be delivering the Constitution Day lecture. As you may know, September 17th is Constitution Day, and this is the day we celebrate when the delegates in Philadelphia signed off on the Constitution in 1787. This is a federal holiday. It's a mandated holiday for educational institutions who receive federal funding of any type to have some kind of programming that educates people about the Constitution. Senator Robert Byrd is the senator who initiated this effort because he thought that people didn't know as much about the Constitution as he thought they should. So as part of the Culinary Institute of America's effort to educate our community about the Constitution, we hand out each year about 500 pocket constitutions. We have a fun Constitution Day quiz for our students, and I deliver the annual Constitution Day lecture. What I like to do in these lectures is I like to make the Constitution relevant. I try to show how what happened 200 plus years ago has relevance today. And in the past, I've looked at free speech on college campuses. I've also looked at the impeachment process. Last year, in honor of the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, we looked at the Supreme Court and the LGBTQ plus community. So this year, I thought perhaps I would shine a bright light on the Constitution and race. I think you would have to be living under a rock somewhere not to know about the protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, the efforts towards civil rights that have been ongoing over the last few months. So I thought it would be a good idea to go back and look at our original Constitution and see where slavery is implicated. Because William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, called the Constitution a covenant with evil. And he has reasons for that, and I think the reasons are very clear. And that is, in order to ratify our Constitution, we had to accept slavery. And in our original Constitution, there are 3 places where slavery is implicated. So structural racism. The Constitution is the structure, the political structure under which we live. And when we look back in history, we see that slavery is indicated in 3 very important places, and these places will have consequences. And remember, history matters because people live their history. So try to think about the people who were living from, say, 1787 until the Civil War. Try to think about what these slaves had to endure. Try to think about the lives that were lived under terror as a result of this moment in time when our Constitution became ratified and, as a consequence, the law of the land. So let's get started. When we first look at the Constitution, we may think that this is a very difficult document to understand, that it was written in archaic language, but it's not a very long document. If you invest an hour to an hour and a half, you can read it from the preamble until the end of the last amendment that had been ratified. But nonetheless, even though we can read this document in a short period of time, it is tremendously important. And when we look at the Constitution, we see that the structure of our government is outlined in primarily the first three articles, where we find in Article 1 the powers of the Congress, Article 2 the power of the President, Article 3 the power of our judicial branch, our federal court system. So let's go right to Article 1, because one of the debates that the delegates had in Philadelphia was, what would our Congress look like? Would it be a one-house Congress? And if so, would each state receive the same representation? Or would it be based on population, where the states who have the most people get the most say? And this was a very, very contentious issue right off the bat. And the way the delegates handled this matter is to come up with what we call a bicameral legislature, a legislative branch that has two houses. The Senate, big state, small state, medium state, 2 senators. The House of Representatives, however, is different. That is based on population. So the states that have the most people are going to have the most representatives in the House of Representatives. I think this is Government 101, something hopefully everybody is familiar with. The next issue, however, was, how do you count the slaves? Or should they be counted at all? From the free northern states' perspective, they shouldn't be counted because the slave owners considered them to be property, that they were unable to assert any civil rights, any say, any of the Bill of Rights that we celebrate. And from the slaveholders' perspective, they wanted their slaves counted, one slave, one person. And there's a reason for that. Because for each slave that would be counted, that would increase that state's population and hence its political representation in the House of Representatives. Ultimately, an agreement is made that each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Well, whether it's 3/5, 4/5, 2/5, the fact remains that for each slave that the slave-holding states could buy, breed, or steal, their population would be increased, and they would have a greater say in our government. So states like Massachusetts that had a greater free population than Virginia didn't get the same number of seats in the House of Representatives that Virginia got. Virginia ended up with 5 more seats because they were able to count 3/5 of their slave population. And this will cause tremendous political damage to our country because it will allow the slave interest to use those slaves, to use those numbers to increase their political power. And that political power was being used primarily to advance the cause of slavery. That's one place in our original Constitution where you can see slavery implicated. It's really curious that the framers don't use the word slavery, but we know what they were writing about. Now, Article 1 also spells out the powers of the Congress. And you can find these in Section 8. And the Congress has the power to declare war, to levy and raise taxes, And there's a catalog of what we call enumerated powers that the Congress has. Section 9 of Article 1, however, states the things that Congress cannot do. And one of the things that's stated in our original Constitution was that the Congress was prohibited from stopping the international slave trade until 1808. So that means if you're a slave owner, you've got 20 years where you can continue to import slaves from Africa. After that, well, they didn't know what was going to happen. It would be possible that the international slave trade would be abolished, but nobody's got a crystal ball, so slave owners begin to bring more and more slaves in from Africa because they just don't know how much after 1808 they'll be able to do it. Well, in 1808, we banned the international slave trade. Don't confuse this with the domestic slave trade. It will still be legal to buy and sell slaves and sell them from Maryland to Georgia, from Georgia to South Carolina. And just because something is against the law, like the international slave trade, that doesn't mean that people are going to stop doing it. In fact, many people try to break the international slave trade. The legal penalties are not as severe as they could be, and Abraham Lincoln is the only American president to sign a death warrant